Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Computer Scientist. Tonight we're travelling back to a fascinating era in gaming history, a time when handheld gaming was just finding its footing, when the idea of carrying a full-colour gaming experience in your pocket seemed like science fiction. We'll be exploring three remarkable devices that dared to challenge Nintendo's dominance. Three handhelds that pushed technological boundaries, captured imaginations, and ultimately failed to survive in one of the most competitive markets in gaming history. These are the stories of the Sega Game Gear, the Atari Lynx, and the SNK Neo Geo Pocket. Each one represented bold ambition, innovative engineering, and genuine passion from their creators. Each one offered something the Game Boy couldn't, and yet each one faded into obscurity, becoming footnotes in gaming history rather than the success stories their makers had envisioned. If you enjoy these quiet explorations of computing and gaming history, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought down in the comments. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is rest, settle in, and allow yourself to drift back to an era when handheld gaming meant something different, something experimental, something that didn't always work out as planned. Let's begin our journey into the world of failed handhelds. To understand why these handhelds failed, we must first understand the world they entered. The late 1980s and early 1990s were a transformative time for video games. Home consoles had recovered from the crash of 1983. Arcades were still thriving with cutting-edge graphics and sound, and a new frontier was opening up: truly portable gaming. Before this era, portable gaming meant simple LCD games with predetermined animations, devices like Nintendo's Game and Watch series. These were entertaining novelties, but they weren't real gaming systems. Each one played a single game, and that was it. The idea of a handheld device that could play multiple games, that could offer experiences similar to home consoles, seemed almost impossible given the technology of the time. Then, in 1989, Nintendo released the Game Boy, and everything changed. The Game Boy wasn't the most advanced handheld of its era. Its screen displayed only 4 shades of green and grey. It had no backlight, meaning you needed good lighting to see anything. Its processor was relatively weak, based on technology that was already years old when the system launched. But the Game Boy had something that would prove more valuable than any technical specification. It was affordable, it had incredible battery life, and most importantly, it had Tetris. The Game Boy's success wasn't just about the hardware. It was about Nintendo's deep understanding of what handheld gaming needed to be. Nintendo knew that a handheld system couldn't just be a smaller version of a home console. It needed to be something different, something that worked within the constraints of portable technology rather than fighting against them. The Game Boy was rugged enough for children to throw in a backpack. It could run for dozens of hours on 4AA batteries. Its library of games, while simple compared to console offerings, was perfectly suited to short gaming sessions. By the time competitors entered the market, the Game Boy had already established itself as the standard. It had sold millions of units. It had third-party support from major publishers. It had brand recognition. Any competitor would need to offer something significantly better to convince consumers to abandon the Game Boy ecosystem they had already invested in. This was the challenge facing Sega, Atari, and SNK. They all believed they had found the answer. They all thought that superior technology, better graphics, more colours, brighter screens would be enough to win over consumers. They all discovered too late that the handheld market operated by different rules than they expected. The story of these failed handhelds is not just about technical specifications or marketing budgets. It's about the fundamental difficulty of disrupting an established market leader. It's about the gap between engineering excellence and commercial success. It's about the harsh reality that in consumer electronics, being better isn't always enough to win. Sega Game Gear, the color powerhouse. Sega's entry into the handheld market seemed inevitable. By 1990, Sega had established itself as Nintendo's primary rival in home consoles. The Sega Genesis, known as the Mega Drive outside North America, was gaining ground against the aging Nintendo Entertainment System. Sega had momentum, a strong brand among slightly older gamers, and the resources to compete in multiple hardware markets simultaneously. The Game Gear was Sega's answer to the Game Boy, but it wasn't designed to be just another handheld. Sega wanted to make a statement. Where the Game Boy offered simple monochrome graphics, the Game Gear would deliver full color. Where the Game Boy's screen was dim and hard to see, the Game Gear would have a backlit display. Where Nintendo played it safe, Sega would be bold. Development of the Game Gear began in 1989, shortly after the Game Boy's release. Sega's engineers faced a fundamental challenge. Creating a handheld with color graphics and a backlit screen required significantly more power than the Game Boy's simple monochrome display. The technology of the early 1990s simply couldn't deliver both features while maintaining acceptable battery life. Sega made a choice. They prioritized visual quality over power efficiency, betting that consumers would accept shorter battery life in exchange for a superior gaming experience. The Game Gear's technical specifications were impressive for a handheld device released in 1990. At its heart was a Zilog Z80 processor running at 3.58 MHz, the same CPU architecture used in the Sega Master System. This wasn't a coincidence. Sega designed the Game Gear to be architecturally similar to the Master System, making it relatively easy for developers to port games between the two platforms. The system had 8 kilobytes of RAM and 16 kilobytes of video RAM, modest amounts even by early 1990s standards, but sufficient for the types of games Sega envisioned. The screen was the Game Gear's showcase feature. It measured 3.2 inches diagonally, with a resolution of 160 by 144 pixels, similar to the Game Boy's 160 by 144 resolution. But where the Game Boy could display only 4 shades of grey, the Game Gear could show 32 colours simultaneously from a palette of 4,096 possible colours. The backlit screen meant the display was visible in any lighting condition, something that would remain a problem for the Game Boy for years to come. The Game Gear launched in Japan on October 6, 1990, with a retail price of 19,800 yen, roughly equivalent to $150 at the time. The North American launch followed in April 1991 at a price point of $149.99. Europe received the system later in 1991. Sega supported the launch with a marketing campaign emphasizing the Game Gear's color screen and superior graphics. Their advertisements directly attacked the Game Boy's monochrome display, with taglines suggesting that color was the future and grayscale was the past. Initial reception was positive. Gaming magazines praised the Game Gear's vibrant display and its library of games that looked and played similarly to Master System titles. The ability to play Sonic the Hedgehog on a handheld was particularly impressive, as Sonic was rapidly becoming Sega's most recognizable character. The launch lineup included titles like Columns, a puzzle game that showed off the system's color capabilities, and Pengo, an arcade port that demonstrated the Game Gear could handle action games. The game library grew steadily through 1991 and 1992. Sega ported many of their popular franchises to the Game Gear. Sonic the Hedgehog arrived in December 1991 and was followed by Sonic the Hedgehog 2, Sonic Chaos, Sonic Triple Trouble, and other entries in the series. These weren't simple demakes of the Genesis versions. They were original games designed specifically for the handheld, with levels and gameplay mechanics tailored to the system's capabilities. Beyond Sonic, the Game Gear hosted impressive versions of other Sega franchises. Shinobi brought ninja action to the handheld. Streets of Rage 2 offered beat-em-up gameplay. Echo the Dolphin provided an atmospheric underwater adventure. Fantasy Zone brought colourful shooting action. The variety was impressive, covering multiple genres and playstyles. Third-party support came from companies like Namco, Capcom, and Acclaim. Namco brought arcade classics like Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man. Capcom delivered fighting game experiences with titles based on Street Fighter II. Disney licenses appeared regularly, with games based on popular animated films. Sports titles from EA Sports provided simulation gameplay for football, basketball, and other sports. Technically, many Game Gear titles pushed the hardware impressively. Games like Gunstar Heroes Showcase showed detailed sprite work and smooth animation. RPGs like Shining Force, The Sword of Asia demonstrated that the system could handle complex, lengthy adventures. Puzzle games took advantage of the color screen to create visually distinct gameplay elements. The marketing strategy focused heavily on older children and teenagers. Sega positioned the Game Gear as the more mature alternative to the Game Boy, much as they positioned the Genesis as more grown-up than the Super Nintendo. Their advertisements featured attitude and edge, playing up the idea that the Game Gear was too cool for kids who played Nintendo. But beneath the impressive specifications and strong marketing, problems were already emerging. The most obvious issue was battery life. The Game Boy could run for 15 to 30 hours on 4A batteries depending on usage. The Game Gear, by contrast, consumed 6AA batteries in 3 to 5 hours. This dramatic difference wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a fundamental design flaw that affected how people could actually use the device. Think about what this meant in practical terms. A child taking a Game Boy on a long car trip could play for hours without worrying about batteries dying. The same child with a Game Gear would need to bring multiple sets of batteries or convince their parents to stop at a store to buy more. The cost of batteries became a significant ongoing expense, potentially doubling or tripling the effective cost of ownership over the system's lifetime. The screen, while impressive, had its own problems. The backlight was necessary because the LCD technology of the era didn't have good contrast or viewing angles. But the backlight was also the primary drain on battery power, and despite the backlight, the screen still struggled in certain lighting conditions. In direct sunlight, the display washed out and became difficult to see. The refresh rate of the LCD caused noticeable ghosting during fast motion, making some action games harder to play than they should have been. The physical design had issues as well. The Game Gear was larger and heavier than the Game Boy, weighing 13.2 ounces compared to the Game Boy's 7.8 ounces. This might not sound like much, but when you're holding something at arm's length for extended periods, every ounce matters. Young children, in particular, found the Game Gear tiring to hold during long gaming sessions. The price point was another barrier. At launch, the Game Gear cost $149.99 compared to the Game Boy's $89.99. That $60 difference was significant for families making purchasing decisions, and the ongoing cost of batteries made the total cost of ownership even higher. Even when Sega reduced the price in later years, the Game Gear never achieved price parity with Nintendo's offering. Game Gear: The Decline. As the 1990s progressed, the fundamental problems with the Game Gear became increasingly apparent. Sales were respectable but never approached Game Boy levels. Sega reported selling approximately 10.62 million Game Gear units worldwide over the system's lifetime, a decent number for any product, but only a fraction of the Game Boy's sales, which exceeded 118 million units. The comparison to the Game Boy was inevitable and damaging. Every review, every discussion, every purchasing decision involved weighing the Game Gear's advantages against the Game Boy's strengths. And while the Game Gear had superior graphics, the Game Boy had everything else: better battery life, lower price, larger game library, stronger third-party support, and crucially it had games that had already sold millions of copies and built dedicated fan bases. The software library, while solid, never reached the depth of the Game Boy's catalogue. Nintendo's first-party titles, particularly Pokémon Red and Blue when they launched in 1996, were system sellers of unprecedented power. Pokémon alone sold millions of Game Boy units and created a cultural phenomenon. Sega had no equivalent. Sonic was popular on the Game Gear, but not at the level that justified purchasing the system specifically to play Sonic games. Third-party support gradually weakened as developers recognized where the larger market was. Creating games for both Game Boy and Game Gear made sense early in the system's life cycles, when installed bases were similar. But as the gap widened, publishers increasingly focused their resources on Game Boy development. Why spend money porting a game to Game Gear when the potential audience was a tenth the size of the Game Boy market? Sega made several attempts to differentiate the Game Gear and extend its appeal beyond gaming. In 1991, they released the TV tuner accessory for the Japanese market, and it came to North America in 1992. The TV tuner attached to the Game Gear's cartridge slot and allowed the system to receive analog television broadcasts. On paper, this was innovative, transforming the Game Gear into a portable television as well as a gaming device. In practice, the TV tuner had limited utility. Reception depended heavily on location and signal strength. The small screen made watching television uncomfortable. Battery life, already poor for gaming, became abysmal when watching TV, draining batteries in about 2 hours. And the market for a portable television was much smaller than Sega anticipated. People who wanted to watch television on the go often had other options, and the Game Gear with TV tuner was too expensive and impractical for most potential users. Other accessories included a rechargeable battery pack, which addressed the battery life issue but added bulk, and required planning ahead to ensure the pack was charged. A magnifying glass attachment attempted to make the small screen easier to see. A car adapter allowed the Game Gear to run from a vehicle's power outlet. None of these accessories solved the fundamental problems or significantly expanded the market. Sega's corporate strategy also worked against the Game Gear's success. By the mid-1990s, Sega was stretched thin, supporting multiple hardware platforms simultaneously. They had the Genesis, the Sega CD add-on, the 32X add-on, the Saturn console, and the Game Gear. Each required marketing, first-party software development, and third-party relationship management. Resources that might have gone into Game Gear development and marketing were diverted to other platforms. The Game Gear's position in Sega's product lineup created conflicts. Should Sega's best developers work on Genesis games that could reach a larger audience, or Game Gear titles for a smaller installed base? Should marketing budgets promote the Saturn as the future, or support the aging Game Gear? These questions had no easy answers, but in practice the Game Gear often lost out to Sega's other priorities. Software releases slowed in the later years, By 1995 and 1996, new Game Gear releases were becoming rare, particularly outside Japan. Many of the games that did appear were low-effort ports or licensed titles, designed to capitalize on movie or television properties rather than providing strong gaming experiences. The sense of momentum that had characterized the early years was gone. The technical limitations that were acceptable in 1991 became more glaring as the decade progressed. Competitors were advancing. The Game Boy received Game Boy Pocket in 1996, a slimmer revision with better screen contrast. The Game Boy Color launched in 1998, finally bringing color graphics to Nintendo's Handheld, while maintaining backward compatibility with the original Game Boy's massive library. By this point, the Game Gear's technical advantages had evaporated. Sega officially discontinued the Game Gear in 1997, though software releases had effectively ended earlier. The system had lasted about 7 years, a respectable lifespan, but it had never fulfilled its promise. It had never become the Game Boy killer Sega hoped for. It had never created its own must-have games that transcended the platform. It had never overcome the fundamental trade-offs that made it less practical than Nintendo's offering. Looking back, we can identify several key mistakes in Sega's approach. The prioritization of graphical quality over battery life was a strategic error. While the color screen impressed in store demonstrations, the impracticality of the battery consumption drove away potential long-term users. Better battery life, even at the expense of some graphical features, would have made the Game Gear more competitive. The pricing strategy was another misstep. Launching at $149.99 positioned the Game Gear as a premium product, but it didn't offer enough premium experience to justify the price difference. A launch price closer to $99.99, even if it meant Sega took a loss on hardware, might have accelerated adoption and built a larger installed base that would have attracted more third-party support. The marketing, while memorable, may have been too aggressive in directly attacking Nintendo. Sega's advertisements created an adversarial relationship with Game Boy owners and their parents, which may have backfired. Rather than convincing people to switch, the ads often reinforced tribal loyalties. People who already owned Game Boys defended their purchase decision. Nintendo fans became more defensive of their preferred brand. The lack of a single killer app hurt the Game Gear throughout its life. Nintendo had Tetris at launch and Pokémon later. The Game Gear had solid games, but nothing that made people say, "I must own this system to play this specific game." Sonic was good on Game Gear, but he was better on Genesis. This pattern repeated across genres. The Game Gear offered good versions of existing franchises, but rarely the definitive version. Despite its commercial failure, the Game Gear left a legacy. It proved that color handheld gaming was possible and desirable. It showed that there was a market for technically advanced portable systems, even if that market was smaller than the mainstream Game Boy audience. It influenced future handheld designs, with many of its features appearing in later systems from various manufacturers. For collectors today, the Game Gear occupies an interesting niche. Systems are relatively common and affordable. Games range from very cheap common titles to expensive rarities. The hardware requires maintenance, as the capacitors in Game Gear units have a tendency to fail after 30 years, causing screen and sound issues. But for those willing to repair or modify their systems, the Game Gear offers a glimpse into an alternative history of handheld gaming, one where graphics and features mattered more than efficiency and practicality. If the Game Gear was ambitious, the Atari Lynx was audacious. Released in September 1989, actually predating both the Game Boy and the Game Gear by several months, the Lynx was the first handheld gaming system with a color LCD display. It was also the first with hardware support for scaling and distortion of sprites, features that wouldn't become common in home consoles for several more years. The Lynx represented a genuine technological leap forward, a glimpse of the future arriving years ahead of its time. The story of the Lynx begins not with Atari, but with Epix, a software company known for games like California Games and Summer Games. In the mid-1980s, Epix decided to venture into hardware development. They assembled a team of talented engineers including Dave Morse, Dave Needle, and R.J. McCall, who would later become legends in gaming hardware design. Their goal was to create a handheld gaming system that would rival the capabilities of home consoles. The team worked throughout 1987 and 1988, designing what they initially called the Handy Game. The system they created was remarkable. It featured custom hardware designed specifically for portable gaming, with innovations that wouldn't appear in other handhelds for years. The heart of the system was a 16-bit CMOS chip design that integrated multiple functions, reducing power consumption while maintaining impressive performance. The technical specifications of the Lynx were astounding for 1989. The system used a 16-bit 65SCZ02 processor running at 4 MHz, with additional custom coprocessors called Mikey and Susie handling sound, graphics and system timing. Mikey managed audio and system control, while Susie was a math coprocessor specifically designed to handle sprite scaling, rotation, and collision detection. Together, these chips could accomplish feats that required dedicated arcade hardware in many contemporary systems. The display measured 3.5 inches diagonally with a resolution of 160 by 102 pixels, slightly smaller than the Game Boy's resolution, but capable of displaying 16 simultaneous colors from a palette of 4096. The screen was backlit and featured surprisingly good contrast for LCD technology of the era. Unlike the Game Gear's screen, which struggled in bright light, the Lynx's display remained visible in various lighting conditions. One of the Lynx's most innovative features was its ambidextrous design. The system could be flipped upside down, and the software would automatically adjust the display orientation. This meant left-handed and right-handed players could both use the system comfortably, something that seems obvious in retrospect but was revolutionary at the time. The buttons were arranged symmetrically, and the system's operating system handled the screen flipping transparently. The Lynx also featured a hardware-based networking system called Comlinks. Up to 8 Lynx units could be connected using a cable for multiplayer gaming. This wasn't just a simple link cable like the Game Boy would later have. The Comlink system used a sophisticated network protocol that allowed multiple players to join and leave games dynamically. Some games supported full 8-player action, creating multiplayer experiences that wouldn't be common in handheld gaming for another decade. The audio capabilities were impressive as well. Mikey included a 4-channel sound chip capable of producing complex audio. The Lynx could play digital samples, something that required special cartridge hardware on the Game Boy. The sound quality was arguably better than the Game Gear's, producing richer, fuller audio despite the small speaker. However, Epix ran into financial difficulties during development. Creating custom hardware is expensive, and Epix didn't have the resources to manufacture and market the system themselves. They needed a partner with deep pockets and industry connections. In 1988, they approached Atari Corporation, then led by Jack Tramiel, the same man who had built Commodore into a personal computer powerhouse. Atari was looking for new product lines to revitalize the company. They agreed to license the Handy Game design and bring it to market as the Atari Lynx. Atari would handle manufacturing, marketing, and distribution, while Epix would receive royalties. It seemed like a perfect partnership. Atari had brand recognition and industry relationships. Epix had cutting-edge technology. Together they would challenge Nintendo's emerging handheld dominance. The Lynx launched in September 1989 in North America with a price of $189.99, positioning it as a premium product. The launch lineup included games like Blue Lightning, a flight combat game that showed off the system's sprite scaling, Gates of Zendikon, a side-scrolling shooter, and California Games, an Epix title that ported well to the new hardware. Reviews were positive, with critics praising the advanced graphics and innovative features. The game library grew through 1990 and 1991, featuring titles that took advantage of the Lynx's unique capabilities. Checkered Flag was a 3D racing game with impressive visuals for a handheld. Chip's Challenge became a cult classic puzzle game. Klax brought arcade puzzle action. Rampage and Paperboy offered arcade-perfect ports. Slime World provided original action-adventure gameplay specifically designed for the platform. Some games demonstrated technical achievements that wouldn't be possible on competing handhelds for years. Hard Drive-In recreated the 3D polygonal racing of the arcade game, complete with loop-the-loops and realistic physics. STU and Runner offered fast-paced tunnel racing with texture-mapped environments. These games showed what the Lynx could do when developers fully utilized its hardware. The multiplayer capabilities, though rarely used due to the need for multiple systems and the Comlinks cable, were genuinely impressive when experienced. Todd's Adventures in Slime World supported 4-player cooperative and competitive play. Warbirds offered dogfighting action for multiple players. The networking was reliable and responsive, creating experiences that felt years ahead of their time. Third-party support came from companies like Tengen, who brought excellent arcade ports including APB and Gauntlet, the Third Encounter. Atari themselves developed quality titles, including several entries in the Lynx exclusive Blue Lightning series and other original games. The overall quality of Lynx software was high, with most games making good use of the hardware rather than being quick cash-ins. Despite the technical excellence and quality software, problems emerged quickly. The most obvious issue was, once again, battery life. The Lynx required 6 AA batteries and consumed them in 4 to 5 hours of gameplay, similar to the Game Gear. Some estimates suggest the Lynx actually had slightly worse battery life than the Game Gear under certain conditions. This made the device impractical for extended portable use without access to replacement batteries or a power adapter. The price point was prohibitive for many potential buyers. At $189.99, the Lynx was expensive, especially compared to the Game Boy's $89.99. The price difference represented a significant barrier, particularly for parents buying systems for children. The Lynx was positioned as a premium product, but most consumers didn't see enough additional value to justify the premium. The physical design, while innovative, had drawbacks. The Lynx was large and heavy, weighing about a pound. Holding it for extended periods was tiring. The button layout, while ambidextrous, placed buttons in positions that weren't always comfortable for extended play. The system felt more like a technical demonstration than a refined consumer product, prioritizing features over ergonomics. Atari Lynx. The struggles. As 1990 turned into 1991, the Lynx's position in the market became increasingly precarious. Atari's marketing efforts were inconsistent and often ineffective. The company lacked the marketing budget and expertise of Nintendo or Sega. Television commercials were rare. Print advertisements appeared sporadically. Retail presence was limited, with many stores carrying only a few Lynx units and games, while dedicating significant shelf space to Game Boy products. Atari Corporation itself was struggling. Jack Tramiel's management style emphasized cost-cutting and financial conservatism. Atari was simultaneously supporting the Lynx, the Atari ST computer line, and the Atari 7800 game console, along with developing the upcoming Jaguar console. Resources were spread thin. Investment in any single platform was limited. The Lynx, despite its technical superiority, never received the sustained financial support it needed to compete effectively. The competitive landscape shifted dramatically with the Game Gear's launch in 1990. Suddenly, the Lynx wasn't competing only with the monochrome Game Boy. It faced another color handheld backed by a company with far deeper pockets and stronger industry relationships. Sega's marketing budget dwarfed Atari's. Sega's third-party relationships brought popular franchises like Sonic to their handheld. Atari had Epyx's back catalogue and whatever they could develop or license internally. Battery consumption remained a persistent complaint. Reviews and word of mouth consistently mentioned the short battery life as a major drawback. Parents who purchased Lynx systems for their children quickly discovered the ongoing cost of batteries. Some estimates suggest that replacing batteries frequently could add hundreds of dollars to the system's lifetime cost of ownership. Rechargeable battery packs were available as accessories, but they added cost and bulk. The screen, while impressive, had issues that became more apparent with use. The LCD technology of the era suffered from persistence, creating ghosting effects during fast motion. Action games sometimes became difficult to play because moving objects left trails across the screen. The backlight, while helpful, created a power drain and generated heat, making the system warm during extended play. Viewing angles, though better than some competing systems, still limited how many people could comfortably watch gameplay at once. Third-party support never materialized at the level Atari needed. Major publishers like Nintendo's close partners, Capcom, Konami, and Square never developed for the Lynx. EA Sports didn't bring their popular sports franchises. The lack of licensed properties hurt as well. Disney, Marvel, and other license holders focused their handheld efforts on Game Boy and Game Gear, where larger audiences awaited. The relationship with Epyx deteriorated. Financial disputes arose over royalties and ongoing support. Epyx's financial problems deepened, eventually leading to bankruptcy. The innovative hardware that had been the Lynx's primary advantage came with no ongoing support from its original designers. Atari was left to support and enhance hardware they hadn't originally created, with limited documentation and no access to the engineers who understood its deepest complexities. In 1991, Atari released the Lynx 2, a redesigned version addressing some complaints. The new model was smaller and lighter, with a clearer screen and longer battery life due to more efficient components. The price dropped to $99.99, finally matching the Game Boy's original launch price. The redesign showed that Atari was listening to feedback and trying to make the Lynx more competitive, but the Lynx 2 arrived too late to change the system's trajectory. By 1991, the Game Boy's installed base was enormous. The Game Gear had established itself as the color alternative. The Lynx, despite improvements, was still playing catch-up. The lower price helped, but it couldn't overcome the perception that the Lynx was a niche product for hardcore gamers rather than a mainstream device. Software releases slowed through 1992 and 1993. High-profile titles became rare. Many releases were ports of older games or low-budget titles that didn't showcase the hardware's capabilities. The sense that the Lynx was a system with a future faded. gamers and developers alike began to see it as a platform in decline, which became a self-fulfilling prophecy as support dried up. Retail presence diminished. Major chains reduced or eliminated their Lynx sections, making the system harder to find and giving consumers the impression it was already discontinued. Games became difficult to purchase outside of specialty stores. The limited availability created a vicious cycle where low sales led to reduced retail presence, which led to even lower sales. Atari's focus shifted to the Jaguar console, which launched in 1993. Marketing resources, development resources, and executive attention moved to the new platform. The Lynx became an afterthought, maintained but not actively promoted. New software became increasingly rare, with the last games appearing in 1994 and 1995 primarily in Europe, where the system had found a small but dedicated following. The Lynx was officially discontinued in 1994, though support had effectively ended earlier. Total sales are estimated at between 2 and 3 million units worldwide, a modest number that never came close to threatening Nintendo's dominance or even matching Sega's Game Gear sales. The system that had been first to market with color graphics, first with hardware sprite scaling, and first with robust multiplayer networking had finished last in the handheld race. Several factors contributed to the Lynx's failure. The battery life issue was never truly solved. Even the Lynx 2's improvements only brought battery consumption to Game Gear levels, still far worse than the Game Boy. This fundamental flaw limited the system's appeal for truly portable gaming, confining it largely to home use with AC adapters, which defeated much of the purpose of a handheld system. The lack of a killer app haunted the Lynx. California Games and Chip's Challenge were good, but they weren't system sellers. The Lynx never had its Tetris, its Sonic, its Pokémon. Without that one game that made people say, "I need to own a Lynx to play this," the system couldn't break through to mainstream consumers. Atari's corporate situation worked against the Lynx's success. A company in better financial health, with stronger industry relationships and deeper marketing expertise, might have been able to leverage the Lynx's technical advantages more effectively. But Atari in the early 1990s was a shadow of its former self, struggling to stay relevant in an industry that had moved beyond the company that had helped create it. The timing was unfortunate. Launching just months before the Game Boy meant the Lynx never had a chance to establish itself before Nintendo's juggernaut arrived. Had the Lynx launched a year or two earlier, it might have built a larger installed base before facing serious competition. Had it launched later, it might have benefited from improved component technology that could have addressed the battery life issues. The technical ambition, while impressive, may have been counterproductive. The Lynx tried to do too much, incorporating features that were expensive to implement and difficult for developers to utilize fully. A less ambitious design focused on maximizing battery life while delivering good color graphics might have been more successful. The Lynx's engineers built a showcase of what was possible, but not necessarily what was practical or marketable. Despite its commercial failure, the Lynx's influence on gaming is undeniable. The concept of handheld networking pioneered by Comlinks would appear in future systems, from the Game Boy's link cable to modern wireless multiplayer. Hardware-accelerated sprite scaling and rotation became standard features in later handhelds. The ambidextrous design, though not widely adopted, showed awareness of player diversity that the industry would eventually embrace more broadly. For collectors and enthusiasts today, the Lynx occupies a special place. It's a cult classic, beloved by those who owned one but never a mass-market success. Systems are relatively affordable, though finding them in good condition with working screens can be challenging. Games range from common and cheap to extremely rare and expensive. The hardware, like the Game Gear, requires maintenance due to aging capacitors and degrading LCD screens. The Lynx represented a path not taken in handheld gaming. It showed that technical excellence alone couldn't guarantee success. It demonstrated that being first to market with advanced features mattered less than execution, support, and understanding what consumers actually wanted. The Lynx was too advanced for its time, too expensive for its market, and too poorly supported by its manufacturer. It was a brilliant machine that deserved better than the fate it received. Our final handheld takes us to the late 1990s, a period when the handheld gaming landscape seemed settled. Nintendo's Game Boy continued to dominate, having survived challenges from both Sega and Atari. The Game Boy Pocket had refined the original design, and the Game Boy Color was on the horizon, promising to finally bring color to Nintendo's handheld platform while maintaining backward compatibility with the massive existing library. It seemed like the handheld wars were over. SNK, a Japanese company known primarily for arcade fighting games and the Neo Geo home console, decided to enter the market anyway. Their reasoning was sound on paper. They had a strong library of fighting game franchises including Fatal Fury, the King of Fighters, and Samurai Showdown. Fighting games were immensely popular in arcades and on home consoles. A handheld optimized for fighting games, backed by SNK's arcade expertise, might carve out a niche even if it couldn't challenge Nintendo directly. The original Neo Geo Pocket launched in Japan on October 28, 1998. It was a curious device, positioned as a budget handheld with monochrome graphics at a time when color was becoming the standard. The system featured a 16-bit Toshiba TLCS 900H processor running at 6,444 MHz, with 12 kilobytes of RAM and 16 kilobytes of video RAM. The screen displayed black and white graphics at a resolution of 160 by 152 pixels. The Neo Geo Pocket's most distinctive feature was its control stick, often called a clicky stick or microswitch joystick. Unlike the directional pads on other handhelds, the Neo Geo Pocket used a small joystick that clicked into 8 directions with tactile, audible feedback. This design was specifically chosen for fighting games, where precise directional inputs are crucial. The stick felt responsive and satisfying to use, providing clear feedback that made executing complex fighting game moves easier than on traditional directional pads. The build quality was excellent. The Neo Geo Pocket felt solid and well constructed, with tight tolerances and a professional finish. The buttons were responsive with good travel and feedback. The system had a premium feel that matched SNK's arcade heritage. It was clear this was a device built by people who understood gaming hardware. Battery life was impressive, especially compared to previous color handhelds. The Neo Geo Pocket ran on 2A batteries and could deliver approximately 20 to 40 hours of gameplay, depending on usage patterns. This was closer to Game Boy's battery efficiency than to the power-hungry Game Gear or Lynx. SNK had learned from competitors' mistakes and prioritized power efficiency. However, the decision to launch with monochrome graphics in 1998 was puzzling. The Game Boy had used monochrome graphics when it launched in 1989, and that made sense for the technology and market of the time. But by 1998, consumers expected color. The Game Boy Color was about to launch. Even budget devices were moving to color displays. SNK's choice to start with monochrome seemed like a step backward. The initial game library was small but focused. SNK brought several of their fighting game franchises to the platform. The King of Fighters R1 delivered surprisingly good fighting game gameplay on a handheld, with multiple characters and movesets faithfully adapted from the arcade. Fatal Fury. First Contact provided another quality fighting experience. Samurai Showdown brought weapon-based fighting to the portable platform. Beyond fighting games, the launch lineup included puzzle games like Puzzle Link and Neo Puzzle League, action games, and even baseball and soccer titles. The games, while monochrome, demonstrated solid programming and good understanding of handheld game design. They were optimized for short play sessions while still offering depth for longer gaming. The Neo Geo Pocket lasted less than a year in its original monochrome form. On March 16, 1999, SNK released the Neo Geo Pocket Color, a full-color revision that addressed the most obvious weakness of the original. Importantly, the Neo Geo Pocket Color maintained backward compatibility, able to play all original Neo Geo Pocket games. Original Neo Geo Pocket owners could upgrade without losing access to their existing library. The Neo Geo Pocket Color represented a significant upgrade. It featured the same processor as the original, but with enhanced specifications: 16 kilobytes of RAM, up from 12, and the ability to display 146 simultaneous colors from a palette of 4,000 geometry discs. The screen resolution remained 160 by 152 pixels. The display was bright, clear, and visible in various lighting conditions, though it lacked a backlight. The clicky stick remained, still distinctive and satisfying to use. The build quality continued to be excellent, and crucially, battery life remained strong. The Neo Geo Pocket Color still ran on 2A batteries and delivered 20 to 30 hours of gameplay, far better than previous color handhelds. SNK had accomplished what Sega and Atari couldn't: a color handheld with acceptable battery life. The Neo Geo Pocket Color launched in Japan in March 1999 and reached North America in August 1999 at a price of $69.99, aggressively undercutting the Game Boy Color's $79.99 price point. Europe received a limited release later in 1999. The lower price and strong battery life seemed like a recipe for success. The game library for the Neo Geo Pocket Color was impressive in quality, featuring some of the best handheld games of the era. The King of Fighters R2 showcased what the system could do, with detailed character sprites, smooth animation, and complex fighting game mechanics condensed into a portable format. The game included multiple game modes, numerous characters, and even a card-collecting metagame. SNK vs. Capcom. The match of the millennium is often considered one of the finest handheld games ever made. This crossover fighting game brought together characters from SNK and Capcom franchises in a package that included not just the fighting game itself, but also a card battle game, a minigame collection, and extensive single-player content. It demonstrated what was possible when developers fully understood and embraced the handheld format. Other fighting games on the platform included SNK vs. Capcom, Card Fighters Clash, which was actually a card battle game rather than a traditional fighter, but used a rich roster of SNK and Capcom characters, Samurai Showdown. 2 improved on the original, Fatal Fury. First Contact received color updates. The Last Blade brought weapon-based combat with beautiful sprite work. Beyond fighting games, the Neo Geo Pocket Color hosted quality titles across genres: Metal Slug, First Mission, and Metal Slug. Second Mission brought the popular run-and-gun arcade series to handhelds with excellent results. These were original games designed for the platform, not simple ports, featuring new levels, mechanics, and content while maintaining the series' signature visual style and frantic action. Puzzle games flourished on the system. Puzzle Bobble Mini combined falling bubble puzzles with character progression. Bust-A-Move Pocket brought the popular puzzle series to handhelds. Neo Turf Masters delivered arcade-quality golf gameplay. Baseball Stars Color provided detailed sports simulation. The variety showed SNK understood the system needed more than just fighting games. Several unusual and creative titles appeared. Biomotor Unitron was an action RPG with mecha customization. Dark Arms, Beast Buster featured horror-themed action-adventure gameplay. Cotton, Fantastic Night Dreams brought cute-em-up shooting action. Facile offered turn-based tactical mecha combat. These games showed creativity and ambition beyond simple arcade ports. Third-party support existed but was limited. Sega provided Sonic the Hedgehog Pocket Adventure, a surprisingly good Sonic game that borrowed heavily from Sonic 2 on Genesis, but adapted well to the Neo Geo Pocket Color's capabilities. This was notable as Sega was supporting a competitor's handheld even after discontinuing their own Game Gear. Other companies like Taito, Data East and ADK contributed games, but major publishers like Nintendo, Capcom, beyond the SNK vs. Capcom collaborations, Square and Electronic Arts, never brought their flagship franchises to the platform. The installed base was too small, and the market window seemed to be closing. The Neo Geo Pocket Color had genuine strengths that could have supported long-term success. The battery life was excellent, finally solving one of the major problems that plagued previous color handhelds. The clicky stick was unique and genuinely superior for certain types of games, particularly fighters. The build quality meant systems could take the abuse of portable use. The price was competitive. The game library, while small, had an unusually high ratio of quality titles. The system didn't have much shovelware or obvious cache-ins. Most Neo Geo Pocket Color games range from good to excellent, with several legitimate classics. For players who owned one, the system delivered consistent quality. Neo Geo Pocket, the short life. Despite these advantages, the Neo Geo Pocket Color faced insurmountable challenges. The most fundamental problem was timing. The system launched in 1999, entering a market where the Game Boy had been dominant for a decade. The Game Boy Color had just launched and was building momentum. Nintendo had brand loyalty, an enormous existing library thanks to backward compatibility, and major franchises that were cultural phenomena. Pokémon, in particular, made competing with Nintendo almost impossible. Pokémon Red and Blue had launched in North America in September 1998, and became a cultural explosion unlike anything gaming had seen before. Pokémon Yellow followed in October 1999. These games sold millions of Game Boy systems by themselves. Children who might have considered alternative handhelds wanted Game Boys specifically to play Pokémon. Nothing SNK could offer competed with that level of cultural saturation. The game library, while high quality, was narrow. Fighting games and action titles dominated, which appealed to a specific demographic but limited mainstream appeal. The system had few games for younger children. It lacked educational software. It didn't have licensed properties based on popular cartoons or movies. These might seem like minor issues, but they mattered when parents were making purchasing decisions for children. Regional availability was problematic. The Neo Geo Pocket Color received only a limited release in Europe. Some European countries never officially received the system at all. This fragmented market presence meant SNK couldn't build momentum in multiple regions simultaneously. Sales were concentrated in Japan and North America, limiting the total addressable market. Marketing was minimal compared to Nintendo's efforts. SNK lacked the marketing budget to run major television campaigns or secure prominent retail placement. The Neo Geo brand had awareness among hardcore arcade and fighting game fans, but minimal recognition among casual gamers or parents buying systems for children. Without massive marketing spend, breaking through Nintendo's dominance was nearly impossible. SNK's financial situation deteriorated rapidly in 1999 and 2000. The company had been struggling for years, with declining arcade revenues and unsuccessful ventures in other areas. The Neo Geo Pocket Color, despite being a quality product, wasn't generating the sales needed to sustain the company. SNK's corporate problems diverted resources and attention from the handheld platform. In October 2000, SNK filed for bankruptcy protection. The company's financial collapse was due to multiple factors beyond the Neo Geo Pocket Color's performance, but the handheld's failure to achieve commercial success contributed to the overall problems. Without profits from the handheld business to offset losses elsewhere, SNK couldn't maintain operations. The bankruptcy had immediate effects on the Neo Geo Pocket Color. Software development stopped, marketing ceased, retail relationships dissolved, systems and games that were in the pipeline were cancelled or never distributed. Within months, the Neo Geo Pocket Color went from being an active platform to a discontinued curiosity. The total number of Neo Geo Pocket Color units sold is estimated at around 2 million worldwide, though exact figures are difficult to verify. This number, while respectable for a niche product, was nowhere near what was needed for the platform to sustain itself. For comparison, the Game Boy Color sold approximately 118 million units over its lifetime. The library of Neo Geo Pocket and Neo Geo Pocket Color games combined totaled around 150 titles, with approximately 82 released for the Neo Geo Pocket Color specifically. Many games received only limited releases outside Japan. Some planned Western releases were cancelled when SNK's financial problems became apparent. The library, while containing gems, never had the depth to compete with established platforms. Hardware availability became a problem after the bankruptcy. Retailers liquidated remaining stock at discount prices. Some gamers discovered the system only when it was already discontinued, purchasing clearance units without realizing there would be no future software support. This created a small but dedicated community of Neo Geo Pocket Color enthusiasts who appreciated the system's qualities even as it faded from the market. SNK was eventually acquired by new ownership and reformed as SNK Playmore, later reverting to simply SNK. The new company focused on reviving SNK's arcade and console game franchises but showed no interest in returning to the handheld market. The Neo Geo Pocket Color remained a brief chapter in SNK's history, a well-executed product that arrived at the wrong time. Several attempts were made to continue support after SNK's bankruptcy. Some developers and publishers considered releasing games they'd been working on, but the lack of manufacturing capability and distribution channels made this impractical. A few homebrew developers eventually created games for the platform, but these were hobbyist projects rather than commercial releases. The Neo Geo Pocket Color's failure can be attributed to factors largely beyond SNK's control. The market timing was unfortunate, launching directly into the height of Pokémon Mania when Nintendo's handheld dominance was at its peak. SNK's financial instability meant the platform never received the sustained support and marketing it needed. The narrow game library, while high quality, appealed primarily to a niche audience. However, SNK also made strategic errors. The decision to launch with the monochrome Neo Geo Pocket first, then release the color version months later, fragmented the market and confused consumers. The limited regional release, particularly in Europe, restricted the potential market. The focus on fighting games, while playing to SNK's strengths, may have been too narrow to support a mainstream handheld platform. The lack of major third-party support was a critical weakness. Without Pokémon, without Mario, without Final Fantasy, without the major franchises that drove console and handheld sales, the Neo Geo Pocket Color was always going to struggle. SNK's games were excellent, but they weren't system sellers at the level needed to compete with Nintendo. The price point, while competitive, may have actually worked against SNK. At $69.99, the Neo Geo Pocket Color was cheaper than the Game Boy Color, which could have signaled to consumers that it was an inferior product. Premium pricing might have positioned it as a higher quality alternative, though this is speculative and might have created other problems. Despite its brief life and commercial failure, the Neo Geo Pocket Color earned a devoted following. Gamers who owned one remember it fondly, often citing it as one of their favourite handheld systems. The combination of excellent battery life, quality construction, the unique clicky stick, and a library of genuinely good games created an experience that many players found more satisfying than contemporary offerings. The system's cult status has grown over time, as the generation that played Neo Geo Pocket Color games in their youth reaches adulthood with disposable income. Collecting for the system has become increasingly popular. Prices for rare games have risen dramatically. Complete in-box systems command premium prices. The Neo Geo Pocket Color has transitioned from failed commercial product to beloved retro collectible. For modern players, the Neo Geo Pocket Color represents what might have been. In an alternate timeline where SNK had stronger financial footing and better market timing, the system's genuine advantages might have carved out a sustainable niche. The games that were released remain playable and enjoyable today, many aging better than contemporary Game Boy Color titles thanks to their focus on tight gameplay, rather than licensed properties or technical showcases. The Neo Geo Pocket Color's legacy includes demonstrating that color handhelds with good battery life were possible. Nintendo learned from competitors' mistakes, and the Game Boy Advance, which launched in 2001, featured color graphics with acceptable battery life, incorporating lessons from all the failed handhelds that came before. The clicky stick influenced future handheld designs. While no major manufacturer adopted the exact mechanism, the emphasis on precise control inputs for handheld gaming continued. Fighting games on handhelds benefited from the Neo Geo Pocket Color's demonstration that the genre could work in portable form with the right control design. SNK's focus on quality over quantity in their game library set an example. The ratio of good games to shovelware on the Neo Geo Pocket Color was unusually high. This showed that a smaller, curated library of excellent games could create a positive user experience even without the depth of larger platforms. The system's rapid discontinuation, while disappointing, at least meant it went out on a high note. Unlike some failed consoles that lingered for years with increasingly poor software, the Neo Geo Pocket Color's library maintained quality throughout its short life. It never had the prolonged decline that characterized the final years of the Game Gear or Lynx. Now that we've explored each system individually, let's step back and examine the common threads that unite these failures. While each handheld had unique circumstances and challenges, certain patterns emerge that help explain why none of them could dislodge Nintendo's Game Boy from its throne. Understanding these patterns offers insights not just into gaming history, but into the broader dynamics of technology markets and consumer behavior. The battery life issue stands out as the most consistent technical problem across the Game Gear and Lynx. Both systems prioritized visual quality and features over power efficiency, resulting in battery consumption that made true portable gaming impractical. The Game Gear lasted 3 to 5 hours on 6 batteries. The Lynx lasted 4 to 5 hours on 6 batteries. Compare this to the Game Boy's 15 to 30 hours on 4 batteries, and the problem becomes clear. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It fundamentally changed how people use these devices. A child with a Game Boy could take it on a long car trip, to a friend's house, or to school without worrying about batteries dying. A child with a Game Gear or Lynx needed to plan ahead, bringing spare batteries or accepting that gameplay would be limited. Parents quickly discovered that the ongoing cost of batteries made these systems more expensive to own than the lower purchase price of the Game Boy. The technical reasons for poor battery life were straightforward. Color LCD screens required significantly more power than monochrome displays. Backlights, which were necessary for the LCD technology of the era to be visible, consumed additional power. More powerful processors and additional chips for graphics and sound added to power draw. The battery technology of the early 1990s simply couldn't provide enough energy in a portable form factor to run these systems for extended periods. What's interesting is that manufacturers knew about this problem during development. Engineers at Sega and Atari understood that their color, backlit systems would consume batteries quickly. They made a calculated decision that consumers would accept the trade-off. They were wrong. Battery life turned out to be more important to the mainstream market than color graphics or advanced features. The Neo Geo Pocket Color, arriving later, benefited from improved technology and learned from predecessors' mistakes. Its 20 to 30 hours of battery life on just 2A batteries proved that color handhelds with acceptable battery efficiency were possible by the late 1990s. But by then the market window had closed, and Nintendo was about to release the Game Boy Advance with similar battery efficiency. Price comparisons reveal another consistent challenge. The Game Gear launched at $149.99. The Lynx launched at $189.99. Both were significantly more expensive than the Game Boy's $89.99 launch price. Even the Neo Geo Pocket Color, which launched at a competitive $69.99, faced a Game Boy Color that had a larger game library and stronger brand recognition. The price difference meant more than just the initial purchase. Parents making buying decisions had to consider not only the hardware cost, but also game prices, battery costs, and accessory costs. When the total cost of ownership was calculated, the competing handhelds became even less attractive. Game Boy games tended to be priced similarly to competing platforms, so the software cost was comparable, but the battery consumption and higher hardware prices tilted the equation firmly in Nintendo's favor. Price reductions came eventually to all three systems, but they arrived too late to change market dynamics. By the time the Game Gear and Lynx reached price parity with the Game Boy, Nintendo had already established an insurmountable lead in installed base and software library. The Neo Geo Pocket Color's competitive pricing from launch couldn't overcome other obstacles. Game library depth and quality represented another critical factor. The Game Boy launched with Tetris, one of the most addictive and universally appealing puzzle games ever created. Tetris alone sold millions of Game Boy units. Later, Pokémon became a cultural phenomenon that transcended gaming, bringing the Game Boy to new heights of popularity and cementing Nintendo's handheld dominance for another generation. None of the competing handhelds had a game that approached Tetris or Pokémon in cultural impact. The Game Gear had Sonic, which was popular, but not at the level that made it a system seller. The Lynx had quality games, but no killer app that made it a must-have device. The Neo Geo Pocket Color had excellent fighting games that appealed to a niche audience but lacked mainstream appeal. Beyond individual titles, the depth of the libraries mattered enormously. The Game Boy's library eventually exceeded 1,000 games. The variety was staggering, covering every genre, age group, and play style. Competing handhelds had libraries in the dozens or low hundreds. Even if the average quality was higher on competing platforms, the sheer choice available on Game Boy was overwhelming. Third-party support tells much of this story. Nintendo had cultivated relationships with major publishers throughout the 1980s. When the Game Boy launched, companies like Capcom, Konami, Square, EA, and dozens of others were ready to develop for the platform. They continued supporting it throughout its life because the installed base made Game Boy development profitable. Competing handhelds struggled to attract similar support. Some third parties developed for Game Gear or Lynx early on, but as sales failed to meet expectations, publishers redirected resources to the Game Boy where larger audiences awaited. The Neo Geo Pocket Color, launching at the height of Game Boy Color's success, faced a chicken and egg problem. Publishers wouldn't commit to developing games without a large installed base. But the system couldn't build an installed base without compelling games from major publishers. Marketing effectiveness played a crucial role. Nintendo was a marketing powerhouse in the late 1980s and 1990s. Their television commercials, print advertisements, and retail presence were ubiquitous. They understood how to market to both children and parents, emphasizing fun, portability, and value. The Game Boy became synonymous with handheld gaming in the public consciousness. Sega's marketing for the Game Gear was aggressive but ultimately ineffective. Their direct attacks on the Game Boy's monochrome screen may have actually reinforced Nintendo's position by keeping the Game Boy in the conversation. Atari's marketing for the Lynx was minimal and poorly targeted. SNK's marketing for the Neo Geo Pocket Color was almost non-existent outside gaming publications. The cost of effective marketing at a national or international level is staggering. Television advertising alone requires budgets in the tens of millions of dollars to achieve saturation. Print ads, retail displays, promotional tie-ins, and all the other components of a comprehensive marketing campaign multiply those costs. Nintendo could afford it. Their competitors, especially Atari and SNK, couldn't match that spending. Retail presence and shelf space created a self-reinforcing advantage for Nintendo. Walk into any toy store, electronics retailer, or department store in the 1990s, and you'd find a large Game Boy section with the system, dozens of games, and various accessories. Competing handhelds might have a small section with the system and a handful of games, or might not be present at all. This visibility mattered enormously for impulse purchases and parental awareness. A parent shopping for a gift who saw a large, well-stocked Game Boy section and a small, sparsely populated Game Gear section would naturally gravitate toward the option that seemed more popular and better supported. The perception of success created actual success through a feedback loop. Timing in the market was perhaps the most underappreciated factor. The Game Boy launched in 1989, creating the modern handheld gaming market. It had a year or more head start on all competitors. The Lynx launched around the same time, but with much less marketing and support. The Game Gear launched 18 months after the Game Boy, by which time Nintendo had already sold millions of units. The Neo Geo Pocket Color's timing was particularly unfortunate. It launched directly into the peak of Pokémon Mania, when the Game Boy Color was flying off shelves. There was no market space left for another handheld. If SNK had entered the market in 1990 or 1991 with the same hardware and games, the outcome might have been different. But by 1999, the window had closed. Nintendo's strategic advantages went beyond any single factor. The company had decades of experience in the gaming industry. They understood game design, hardware development, publisher relations, marketing and retail distribution. They had financial resources to weather setbacks and invest in long-term platform success. They had brand loyalty built over years of delivering quality products. More subtly, Nintendo understood that handheld gaming was different from home console gaming. The Game Boy wasn't designed to replicate the NES experience in portable form. It was designed around the constraints and opportunities of portable gaming. Games were structured for short play sessions. Graphics were optimized for the small, low-resolution screen. Power consumption was minimized to maximize portability. Competitors often approached handhelds as miniature consoles, trying to cram console experiences into portable devices. This led to design choices that prioritized graphical quality and features over practicality. The Game Gear essentially being a portable Master System sounds appealing, but it meant the system inherited the Master System's power requirements, without the benefit of being plugged into a wall outlet. The ecosystem effect amplified Nintendo's advantages over time. As more people bought Game Boys, more developers created Game Boy games. As more games appeared, more people bought Game Boys. Network effects kicked in with the link cable and multiplayer games. Pokémon's trading mechanism required multiple systems and copies of the game, creating incentive for friend groups to all own Game Boys. Breaking into an established ecosystem is one of the hardest challenges in technology markets. It's not enough to be better. You need to be so much better that consumers are willing to abandon their existing investment and start over. None of the competing handhelds were that much better. They had advantages in specific areas, but the overall package never justified switching for most consumers. The installed base advantage meant that even when Game Boy hardware was clearly inferior, as it was compared to the Game Gear or Lynx, it didn't matter. Parents buying for children wanted the system their child's friends had. Developers wanted to target the largest audience. Retailers wanted to stock the products that sold best. Everyone's individual rational choice reinforced Nintendo's position. Looking across all three failed handhelds, we can identify several common mistakes. Prioritizing technical specifications over user experience was a recurring error. All three systems had impressive specs that looked good in marketing materials but didn't translate to better practical experiences. The Game Boy's inferior hardware delivered a superior user experience through better battery life, lower cost, and smarter software design. Underestimating the importance of software was another consistent problem. Hardware is just a platform for software. Without compelling games that people want to play, the hardware is worthless. Nintendo understood this deeply, creating and nurturing franchises that became reasons to own their hardware. Competitors focused more on hardware capabilities and assumed good software would follow naturally. Insufficient marketing and retail support hurt all three platforms. Even excellent products fail without awareness and availability. The investment required to compete with Nintendo at a marketing and retail level was enormous, and none of Nintendo's competitors could or would match that investment. This meant they were always fighting at a disadvantage, their products less visible and less available than the Game Boy. Financial constraints limited all three challengers. Atari was barely surviving as a company. Sega was spread thin, supporting multiple hardware platforms. SNK went bankrupt. Nintendo, meanwhile, had the financial strength to sustain the Game Boy through slow periods and invest in its long-term success. Money might not guarantee success, but lack of money almost guarantees failure in competitive markets. The failure to differentiate meaningfully beyond graphics was a subtle but important mistake. All three systems emphasized better graphics as their primary advantage. But for many consumers, graphics weren't the most important factor in handheld gaming. gameplay, portability, battery life, price, and game selection mattered more. By focusing messaging on graphics, competitors were fighting on ground that didn't matter as much as they thought, the games that defined them. Despite their commercial failures, these three handhelds hosted some genuinely excellent games that deserve recognition. These titles represented the potential of each platform and showed what might have been if circumstances had been different. Let's explore some of the standout titles that defined each system and remain playable and enjoyable today. The Game Gear's library was anchored by Sonic the Hedgehog titles. The original Sonic the Hedgehog, released in December 1991, was an impressive achievement for a handheld. While it couldn't match the speed and spectacle of the Genesis versions, it captured the essence of Sonic gameplay. The level design was tailored to the handheld format, with stages that worked within the technical constraints while maintaining the series' platforming challenge. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 on Game Gear was actually quite different from its Genesis counterpart, featuring unique levels and gameplay elements. This pattern continued with later entries. Sonic Chaos introduced new abilities like Sonic's Super Peel-Out move. Sonic Triple Trouble added more gameplay variety with multiple playable characters and varied level gimmicks. These weren't just ports, but original games that expanded the Sonic universe. Beyond Sonic, Shinobi brought ninja action to the Game Gear with surprisingly good results. The game featured multiple levels, boss fights, and the satisfying gameplay of throwing shuriken and using ninja techniques. The graphics were detailed for the hardware, with good sprite work and atmospheric environments. It showed that action games could work well on the Game Gear's small screen. Gunstar Heroes, a late release in 1995, demonstrated what the Game Gear could accomplish with skilled development. The game featured impressive visual effects, smooth scrolling, varied weapons, and intense boss battles. It wasn't quite the visual spectacle of the Genesis original, but it was remarkably close and showcased the hardware's capabilities when developers took the time to optimize their code. The puzzle game library on Game Gear was strong. Columns, a Tetris-like falling block puzzle game, was a launch title that showed off the color screen's ability to make matching puzzles more visually clear than on monochrome screens. Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine brought competitive puzzle gameplay with a Sonic theme. These games were perfect for the handheld format, offering quick, addictive gameplay sessions. RPGs appeared on the Game Gear, though they were rare. Shining Force, the Sword of Hajia delivered strategic RPG gameplay with the franchise's distinctive style. The game featured dozens of playable characters, tactical combat, and a lengthy story. The fact that a game of this scope worked on a handheld was impressive, even if battery life made completing it challenging without a power adapter. The Atari Lynx's library, though smaller, contained several technical showcases and unique experiences. Blue Lightning was a launch title that demonstrated the system's sprite scaling capabilities. Players flew a combat jet in missions that featured smooth scaling effects as targets grew larger or smaller. For 1989, this was extraordinary in a handheld device. Chip's Challenge became the Lynx's most enduring classic. This puzzle game featured 148 increasingly complex levels, where players navigated mazes, collected items, and solved logical challenges. The game was addictive, with just one more level compelling players forward. It later received ports to other platforms, becoming a cult classic that introduced many people to the Lynx library, even if they never owned the system. California Games brought the popular Epix sports series to the Lynx. The game featured multiple events including BMX racing, skateboarding, surfing, and more. Each event had distinct gameplay mechanics, good controls, and colourful graphics. It showcased the Lynx's abilities while providing varied gameplay that worked well in short sessions. Todd's Adventures in Slime World was an original action-adventure game designed specifically for the Lynx. Players explored levels filled with enemies, hazards, and secrets. The game supported multiplayer through the Com-Lynx cable, allowing cooperative and competitive play. It became a cult favourite and demonstrated how original games designed for the hardware could be more successful than quick ports. Hard driving was a technical marvel. The arcade game featured 3D polygon graphics and driving physics, cutting-edge technology for its time. The Lynx version impressively replicated much of this, with players driving through 3D environments, performing stunts like loop-the-loops, and experiencing crashes with surprising visual fidelity. It showed what the Lynx's custom hardware could accomplish. Warbirds provided combat flight simulation with networked multiplayer support for up to 4 players. The game featured multiple World War I-era aircraft, various mission types, and impressive visuals for a handheld. The multiplayer dogfighting mode was particularly memorable, creating experiences that wouldn't become common in handhelds for many more years. The Neo Geo Pocket Color's library was smaller, but maintained a remarkably high average quality. SNK vs. Capcom, the match of the millennium, stands as perhaps the finest game on the platform and one of the best handheld games of its generation. The fighting game featured 26 characters from SNK and Capcom franchises, fluid animation, responsive controls, and multiple game modes including a deep single-player campaign. But Match of the Millennium was more than just a fighting game. It included a card battle game where players collected cards featuring characters and used them in strategic battles. It had Olympic-style minigames testing reflexes and timing. It featured unlockable content and secrets that rewarded exploration. The amount of content packed into a handheld cartridge was staggering. The King of Fighters R2 showcased SNK's fighting game expertise. With 14 playable characters, multiple fighting styles, and smooth gameplay, it proved that complex fighting games could work on handhelds. The Striker system added strategic depth, allowing players to call assist characters during battle. The clicky stick was perfect for executing special moves, making the experience superior to fighting games on systems with traditional directional pads. SNK vs. Capcom, Card Fighters Clash was a card battle game featuring characters from both companies' franchises. Players built decks and engaged in strategic battles where positioning, resource management, and card synergies mattered. The game had depth that kept players engaged for dozens of hours, with 2 versions, Capcom and SNK, that encouraged trading cards between cartridges. Metal Slug, First Mission and Second Mission, brought the popular run-and-gun series to handhelds with original games. These weren't simple ports, but new entries designed for the platform. They featured the series' signature hand-drawn visuals, intense action, diverse weapons, and challenging gameplay. The detailed sprite work showed off the Neo Geo Pocket Color's graphics capabilities. Sonic the Hedgehog Pocket Adventure remains notable as Sega's official Sonic game for a competitor's handheld. The game borrowed heavily from Sonic 2 on Genesis but adapted the experience well to the Neo Geo Pocket Color. It featured multiple zones, the spin dash move, special stages for collecting Chaos Emeralds, and even a 2-player competitive mode. The fact that it existed at all was surprising. That it was actually good was remarkable. Puzzle games found a home on the Neo Geo Pocket Color. Puzzle Bobble Mini delivered the bubble-shooting gameplay the series was known for, with a story mode adding character progression. The bright graphics and clear visual design made matching bubbles satisfying. These puzzle games were perfect for the handheld format, offering quick gameplay sessions that could extend as long as players wanted. Lesser-known gems existed on all three platforms. The Game Gear had titles like Wonder Boy, The Dragon's Trap, an action-adventure game with transformation mechanics. The Lynx had Electrocop, an action game with impressive digitized graphics. The Neo Geo Pocket Color had Facile, a turn-based mecha strategy game that remains a hidden gem. What's striking when examining these games is that none of them were bad. The average quality across all three platforms was high. There were few obvious cache-ins or lazy ports. Developers who worked on these systems generally put in effort to create quality experiences. The problem was never that the games weren't good enough. It was that not enough people knew about them, or had access to the hardware to play them. To fully understand these systems and why they succeeded or failed in specific areas, we need to examine their technical specifications in detail. The engineering choices made during development determine not just capabilities, but also limitations that shaped each platform's destiny. Screen technology represented the most visible difference between systems. The Game Boy used a reflective twisted pneumatic LCD with no backlight, displaying 4 shades of green-grey. This technology was cheap, power-efficient, and didn't require illumination beyond ambient light. The downsides were obvious. The screen was dim, had poor contrast, narrow viewing angles, and was nearly invisible in low light or bright sunlight. The Game Gear used a backlit active metrics TFT LCD capable of displaying 32 colors from a 4096 color palette at 160 by 144 resolution. The backlight was essential because LCD technology of the early 1990s had poor native contrast. The screen consumed significant power, with the backlight alone accounting for much of the battery drain. The color quality was impressive for the time, though by modern standards the colors were washed out and the response time caused ghosting. The Atari Lynx used a similar backlit color LCD but with some technical advantages. The screen had better contrast than the Game Gear's display and maintained visibility across wider viewing angles. The 160 by 102 resolution was slightly lower than the Game Gear's, but the ability to display 16 simultaneous colors from a 4096 color palette produced visually impressive results. The Lynx's screen could also be dimmed to save battery power, though most users kept it at full brightness for optimal visibility. The Neo Geo Pocket Color's screen was a reflective SDN LCD capable of displaying 146 simultaneous colors from a 4096 color palette. The lack of a backlight was initially perceived as a disadvantage, but the screen had excellent contrast and clarity in ambient light. It was visible in bright outdoor conditions where backlit screens washed out. However, it was useless in darkness without external lighting. The power savings from no backlight contributed significantly to the system's excellent battery life. CPU and memory architecture reveals much about each system's design philosophy. The Game Boy used a Sharp LR35902 processor, essentially an 8-bit hybrid between the Intel 880 and Zilog Xeon running at 419 MHz. It had 8 KB of RAM and 8 KB of video RAM. This was modest even in 1989, but Nintendo designed around the constraints effectively. Games used bank switching to access larger cartridge memory spaces, and efficient programming extracted impressive results from limited resources. The Game Gear used a Zilog Z80 running at 3.58 MHz with 8 KB of RAM and 16 KB of video RAM. The processor was actually slightly slower than the Game Boy's, but the additional video RAM and dedicated graphics hardware gave it superior visual capabilities. The architecture was nearly identical to the Sega Master System, which simplified porting games but also meant the Game Gear inherited design choices made for a home console rather than a portable device. The Lynx featured a custom 16-bit architecture that was significantly more advanced than its contemporaries. The main CPU was a 6550 ROS2, running at 4 MHz, supplemented by 2 custom coprocessors. Mikey handled sound, timers and serial communications, while Suzy performed sprite rendering, scaling, rotation, and collision detection. The system had 64 kilobytes of RAM shared between the main CPU and coprocessors. This architecture could accomplish effects that required dedicated arcade hardware in many competing systems. The Neo Geo Pocket Color used a 16-bit Toshiba TLCS 900H processor running at 6.144 MHz, with 12 kilobytes of RAM for the original Neo Geo Pocket and 16 kilobytes for the color version. Additional hardware included 4 kilobytes of video RAM and dedicated graphics chips for sprite handling. The architecture was efficient and well designed for 2D gaming, though it lacked the hardware-accelerated scaling and rotation of the Lynx. Battery technology and power consumption determined practical usability. All these systems used AA batteries, which in the early 1990s provided roughly 2,500 mAh per battery for alkaline cells. The Game Boy's efficient design drew approximately 1790 milliwatts during gameplay, allowing it to run for 20 to 30 hours on 4 batteries, providing a total of about 9,000 mAh at 6 volts. The Game Gear consumed approximately 1,1200 milliwatts, primarily due to the backlit color screen. 6 batteries provided roughly 15,000 mAh at 9 volts, but the higher power draw meant only 3 to 5 hours of runtime. Users quickly learned that rechargeable batteries, while environmentally friendlier and economically sensible long-term, often provided even shorter runtime due to their lower capacity. The Lynx's power consumption was similar to the Game Gear's, around 1,1100 milliwatts. 6 batteries gave roughly 4 to 5 hours of gameplay. The ability to dim the screen could extend this slightly, but not enough to compete with the Game Boy. Both the Game Gear and Lynx suffered from a fundamental physics problem. Color backlit LCDs of that era simply required too much power for battery technology to handle effectively in a portable device. The Neo Geo Pocket Color, benefiting from nearly a decade of technological advancement, managed much better efficiency. Running on just 2A batteries providing about 6,000 mAh at 3 volts, it drew only 100–150 milliwatts during gameplay. This gave 20 to 30 hours of battery life, comparable to the original Game Boy despite having color graphics. The lack of backlight was the primary factor, but improved LCD technology and more efficient chip design also contributed. Sound capabilities varied across systems. The Game Boy had a 4-channel audio chip with 2 square wave channels, 1 programmable wave channel, and 1 white noise channel. It was simple but effective, and skilled composers created memorable music within its constraints. The small speaker and limited frequency range meant audio was tinny and sometimes harsh, but the sound was clear and distinct. The Game Gear featured a 3-channel programmable sound generator similar to the Master System's, capable of producing more complex waveforms than the Game Boy. It also supported stereo output through the headphone jack. The audio quality was richer and fuller than the Game Boy's, with better bass response and clearer high frequencies. However, the mono speaker on the unit itself didn't showcase these capabilities well. The Lynx had sophisticated audio hardware in its Mikey chip. 4 channels could each play different waveforms with independent volume control, allowing for complex musical compositions. The system could play PCM samples at various rates, enabling sound effects and voice samples that other handhelds couldn't match. The stereo headphone output delivered excellent quality, though again the built-in speaker limited what users heard without headphones. The Neo Geo Pocket Color included a programmable sound generator with stereo output capabilities. While not as advanced as the Lynx's audio system, it produced clear, pleasant sound suitable for the types of games on the platform. Fighting games benefited from crisp sound effects, while puzzle games had cheerful musical accompaniment. The monospeaker was adequate, and the headphone output delivered good quality stereo. Build quality and durability affected long-term ownership. The Game Boy was famously durable, with units surviving falls, impacts, and environmental exposure that would destroy most electronics. Nintendo's design prioritized ruggedness, using thick plastic shells and secure button mechanisms. The simple internal design with few moving parts meant less could break. Game Boy units from 1989 still function today, testament to the engineering quality. The Game Gear was less durable, with the larger size and more complex internals creating more potential failure points. The capacitors used in the system have proven particularly problematic, degrading over time and causing audio and video issues. Most Game Gear units today require capacitor replacement to function properly. The screen itself was delicate, and the system's weight meant drops could cause significant damage. That said, well-maintained units still work when properly repaired. The Lynx had excellent build quality despite its size. The plastic shell was sturdy, the buttons were responsive and durable, and the overall construction felt solid. However, like the Game Gear, aging capacitors cause problems in surviving units. The screen's LCD can develop dead pixels or complete failure after 3 decades. The complexity of the internal hardware means repairs require more expertise than simpler systems. Still, functioning Lynx units demonstrate the quality of the original engineering. The Neo Geo Pocket Color was built like a tank. SNK's attention to build quality resulted in a system that felt premium and durable. The plastic was thick and resistant to scratches and impacts. The clicky stick mechanism was robust and reliable. Buttons had satisfying tactile feedback and showed little wear even after extensive use. The simple internal design with fewer components than earlier color handhelds meant less could go wrong. Neo Geo Pocket Color units generally still work today without requiring repairs. Accessories and peripherals expanded functionality with mixed success. The Game Boy had a thriving accessory market including the link cable for multiplayer gaming, the Game Boy camera and printer, various carrying cases, screen magnifiers and lights, and countless unofficial accessories. The link cable became particularly important with Pokémon, driving accessory sales and creating network effects that strengthened the platform. The Game Gear's TV tuner was its most ambitious accessory, but as discussed earlier, it had limited practical utility. The rechargeable battery pack addressed the battery life issue, but added significant bulk and cost. The Master Gear converter allowed Game Gear systems to play Master System games, which was creative but of limited value given the small Master System library in Western markets. Various screen magnifiers and lights existed, but were less necessary given the backlit screen. The Lynx's Comlinks cable enabled networked multiplayer for up to 8 systems. This was genuinely innovative, but the requirement that all players own Lynx systems severely limited its use. In practice, most Lynx owners never experienced multiplayer because they didn't know other Lynx owners. Other accessories included carrying cases, rechargeable battery packs, and the standard collection of third-party peripherals. None significantly expanded the market. The Neo Geo Pocket Color had minimal accessory ecosystem. A link cable existed for multiplayer and data transfer between cartridges, used primarily for card trading in games like Card Fighters Clash. Carrying cases and pouches protected the system. But the short market life meant few accessories were developed or released. The system didn't really need many accessories as its core design was already well executed. Physical design and ergonomics affected user comfort during extended play. The Game Boy's design was straightforward and functional. The controls were positioned logically. The system was light enough to hold comfortably for extended periods, and the rectangular form factor fit well in hands of various sizes. The design wasn't particularly innovative, but it worked effectively for its intended purpose. The Game Gear was large and heavy, measuring 8.4 by 4.25 by 1.5 inches and weighing 13.2 ounces without batteries. Holding it at the proper viewing distance for the screen meant supporting significant weight at arm's length. Young children in particular struggled with the size and weight during long gaming sessions. The button layout was functional, but the overall ergonomics were compromised by the system's bulk. The Lynx was even larger and heavier than the Game Gear, at 1075 by 444 by 1.63 inches and approximately 1 pound. It was more of a portable device than a truly handheld one, comfortable for tabletop play but tiring to hold for extended periods. The ambidextrous design was clever but didn't fully compensate for the awkward size. The Lynx felt like a technical demonstration that hadn't been fully refined into a consumer product. The Neo Geo Pocket Color was compact and comfortable, measuring 4.8 by 3 by 1 inches and weighing just 4.2 ounces. It fit easily in pockets, was light enough for extended handheld play, and had a button layout that worked well for most games. The clicky stick was positioned prominently and worked excellently for fighting games, though some players found it less ideal for other genres. Overall, the ergonomics were well considered and user-friendly. Legacy and collecting. Today, 3 decades after their releases, these failed handhelds have found new life as collector's items and objects of nostalgia. The retro gaming community has embraced them, preserving their games and hardware while re-evaluating their place in gaming history. What failed commercially has succeeded culturally, remembered fondly by those who experienced them, and discovered with curiosity by younger gamers exploring gaming's past. The collector market for these systems has grown significantly in recent years. Game Gear systems are relatively common, with thousands of units still in circulation. Prices for working systems range from $30 to $70 depending on condition. However, most require capacitor replacement to function properly, which adds cost and complexity. Reconditioned units with new capacitors command higher prices. Special editions like the Red Sports model or various Japanese exclusive colors are more valuable. Game Gear games range from extremely cheap to moderately expensive. Common titles like Sonic or sports games can be found for $5 to $10. Mid-tier games typically sell for $15 to $30. Rare titles like certain RPGs or late releases can reach $100 or more, though truly expensive Game Gear games are rare. Complete in-box games command premiums over loose cartridges, particularly for sought-after titles. The Lynx collector market is smaller but more passionate. Systems sell for $50 to $150, depending on condition and model. The original Lynx, being larger and less common, sometimes commands higher prices than the Lynx 2. Like the Game Gear, most Lynx units need capacitor replacement for reliable operation. Well-maintained or professionally refurbished units are prized by collectors. Lynx games have a wider price range than Game Gear titles. Common games start around $10 to $20. Mid-range titles sell for $30 to $60. Rare games, particularly later releases that had limited production runs, can exceed $200 for complete copies. The smaller overall library means completionists have an easier time collecting for Lynx than for systems with hundreds of titles, though the rarity of some games presents challenges. The Neo Geo Pocket Color collector market is perhaps the most interesting. Systems are relatively affordable, typically selling for $40 to $80. The build quality means many units still function perfectly without repairs, though batteries in some cartridges may need replacement for save functionality. The system's small size and durability make them appealing to collectors who want to actually play their collections rather than just display them. Neo Geo Pocket Color games show dramatic price variation. Common titles are quite affordable, often under $20 even complete in box. Popular games like Match of the Millennium or the Metal Slug titles typically sell for $30 to $60. However, rare titles, particularly those that had limited Western releases or were Japan exclusive, can command prices well into the hundreds of dollars. Facile, an obscure but excellent strategy game, regularly sells for over $300 complete. The collecting community has developed around each platform. Online forums, social media groups, and dedicated websites provide information about games, hardware maintenance, and collecting strategies. Enthusiasts share repair guides, helping newcomers learn to replace capacitors or fix common problems. The communities are generally welcoming, helping preserve and promote systems that might otherwise fade into complete obscurity. Emulation and preservation have become increasingly important for these systems. All three handhelds have mature, accurate emulators that can run games on modern computers and devices. This ensures the games remain playable even as original hardware ages and fails. Some collectors use emulation to preview games before purchasing physical copies, while others prefer emulation as their primary way to experience these libraries. ROM preservation efforts have catalogued and archived the complete libraries of all three systems. Organizations dedicated to video game preservation have ensured that even rare games with few surviving cartridges are preserved digitally. This work is crucial, as some games exist in only tiny numbers of physical copies, and cartridge failure could otherwise result in permanent loss. Homebrew communities have emerged for all three platforms, with modern developers creating new games for decades-old hardware. The Game Gear homebrew scene produces new titles that push the hardware in ways commercial developers never explored. The Lynx community has seen several impressive homebrew releases that showcase what the hardware could have accomplished with more development support. The Neo Geo Pocket Color homebrew scene, while smaller, has produced quality titles that add to the platform's library. Flash cartridges and modern peripherals have made these systems more practical for contemporary users. Flash cartridges allow users to load multiple ROM files onto a single cartridge that can be used in original hardware. This lets collectors experience entire libraries without needing to own every physical cartridge. Modern rechargeable battery solutions improve battery life and eliminate the need for constantly purchasing disposable batteries. Screen modification communities have developed aftermarket solutions for these systems. The Game Gear in particular has benefited from modern LCD replacement screens with better contrast, brightness, and viewing angles than the original display. Some modifications add backlights to systems that lacked them or improve existing backlights. These modifications can transform the user experience, making decades-old hardware practical for modern gaming. The market for modified systems has grown alongside the modding community. Professionally modified units with new screens, improved audio, rechargeable batteries, and cosmetic enhancements sell for premium prices. Some modders create custom shells or color schemes, producing unique systems that blend nostalgia with modern improvements. This market caters to collectors who want the authentic experience of playing on original hardware, but with practical improvements. Price trends for these systems and their games have generally trended upward over the past decade. As retro gaming has become more popular and mainstream, demand for once-forgotten systems has increased. Games that sold for $5 in the early 2000s now command $10 or $20. Rare titles that were affordable a decade ago have seen prices multiply several times over. This appreciation has turned some collections into significant financial investments. However, the market remains relatively accessible compared to more popular systems. A complete North American Game Gear library is still achievable for a motivated collector with a reasonable budget. The Lynx library is smaller and more expensive per title, but still within reach. The Neo Geo Pocket Color presents the biggest challenge due to some extremely expensive titles, but most of the library remains affordable. Modern appreciation for these systems has grown as gaming enthusiasts re-evaluate their qualities beyond commercial success. The Game Gear is recognized for pushing color handheld gaming forward despite its flaws. The Lynx is celebrated as a technical marvel that was ahead of its time. The Neo Geo Pocket Color is praised for its excellent build quality and outstanding fighting game library. Commercial failure no longer defines these systems as comprehensively as it once did. YouTube content creators and gaming historians have introduced these systems to new audiences. Video essays examining their history, technical specifications, and libraries have garnered millions of views. Let's Play videos and gameplay footage showcase their games to people who never experienced them during their original release. This exposure has fueled renewed interest and collecting activity. The broader lesson from these systems' modern lives is that commercial failure isn't permanent obscurity. Cultural memory persists, and later generations can discover and appreciate products that their contemporaries overlooked. The Game Gear, Lynx, and Neo Geo Pocket Color failed to achieve commercial success, but they succeeded in creating experiences that people remember fondly and continue to enjoy decades later. Conclusion. Lessons learned. As we reach the end of our journey through these failed handhelds, it's worth reflecting on what they teach us about technology, markets, and the nature of competition. These systems weren't failures because they were poorly designed or lacked merit. They failed because success in consumer electronics requires more than technical excellence. It requires timing, marketing, software support, financial resources, and sometimes simple luck. The most obvious lesson is that battery life matters more in portable devices than almost any other specification. The Game Gear and Lynx proved that consumers wouldn't accept 3 to 5 hour battery life regardless of graphical superiority. The Neo Geo Pocket Color's success in achieving acceptable battery life with color graphics came too late to matter, but it validated what should have been obvious. Portability requires practical battery performance. Modern handhelds have internalized this lesson. The Nintendo Switch, Sony's PlayStation Portable and Vita, and various gaming-focused phones all prioritize battery life in their designs. 3 to 6 hours has become an acceptable minimum for modern devices, though this still represents a compromise. The most successful modern portable devices like smartphones achieve all-day battery life through aggressive power management and efficient hardware design. The second lesson is that software sells hardware, not the reverse. Nintendo understood this instinctively, creating or nurturing franchises like Mario, Pokémon, and The Legend of Zelda that became reasons to own Nintendo hardware. The Game Boy would have failed without Tetris, without Pokémon, without the deep library that gave consumers reasons to choose it over technically superior competitors. Modern platform holders still follow this wisdom. Sony invested heavily in first-party studios to create exclusive PlayStation games. Microsoft acquired game developers to strengthen Xbox's software lineup. Nintendo continues producing hardware that's less powerful than competitors, but sells based on exclusive software. The pattern established in the handheld wars of the 1990s continues today. The third lesson involves network effects and ecosystems. The Game Boy's success built on itself through multiplayer features, compatible accessories, and the social dynamics of gaming. When your friends owned Game Boys, you wanted a Game Boy to play with them. When developers saw large installed bases, they created more games, which attracted more buyers. Breaking into an established ecosystem is extraordinarily difficult. This explains much about modern technology markets. Facebook remains dominant in social networking despite competitors offering superior features, because that's where the users are. Windows maintains its grip on desktop computing because that's where the software is. The iPhone leads the smartphone market partly because of the App Store ecosystem. First-mover advantages and network effects create moats around market leaders. The fourth lesson is that being first with advanced features doesn't guarantee success. The Lynx had sprite scaling before the Super Nintendo. The Game Gear had color before the Game Boy Color. The Neo Geo Pocket Color had excellent battery life in a color handheld before the Game Boy Advance. None of these advantages translated into market dominance, because features alone don't drive mass market adoption. This pattern repeats throughout technology history. Xerox developed the graphical user interface before Apple. Betamax offered superior quality to VHS. HD DVD had studio support before Blu-ray ultimately won. Being first or best matters less than execution, marketing, timing, and building comprehensive experiences that satisfy consumer needs beyond technical specifications. The fifth lesson involves the importance of financial resources and corporate stability. Atari's declining fortunes limited Lynx support. Sega's overextension across multiple platforms hurt the Game Gear. SNK's bankruptcy killed the Neo Geo Pocket Color. Nintendo's financial strength allowed them to weather the Game Boy's slow start and invest in long-term platform success. Money might not buy success, but lack of money almost guarantees failure in competitive markets. Modern platform holders demonstrate this reality. Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo all have deep financial resources, allowing them to sustain hardware platforms through challenging periods. Smaller companies attempting to enter gaming hardware markets, like Ouya or various Android gaming devices, typically fail despite sometimes interesting ideas because they lack resources to compete effectively. The sixth lesson is about the danger of direct competition with dominant market leaders. All three challengers position themselves against the Game Boy, emphasizing their superiority in graphics and features. This framing invited direct comparison, which highlighted their weaknesses as much as their strengths. Alternative positioning focusing on different use cases or audiences might have been more successful. This suggests that disrupting market leaders requires either differentiation that creates new market spaces or advantages so overwhelming that switching costs are justified. Incremental improvements rarely overcome incumbent advantages. The companies that successfully challenged Nintendo in handheld gaming, like smartphones, did so by offering entirely different value propositions rather than trying to beat Nintendo at their own game. The seventh lesson involves the importance of timing. Markets have windows when new entrants can establish themselves. The Game Boy opened the modern handheld gaming market in 1989, and closed the window quickly by capturing mindshare and market share. Later entrants found the window closed, regardless of their product's merits. Understanding market timing is crucial for platform success. This timing challenge continues today. The tablet market opened around 2010 and was quickly dominated by Apple's iPad. Competitors found the window closing rapidly. The streaming service market opened gradually through the 2010s and now appears increasingly closed as dominant players have established themselves. Timing market entry remains one of the most critical and difficult decisions in technology strategy. The eighth lesson is that price matters, but value matters more. The Game Gear and Lynx couldn't succeed by just matching Game Boy's price because they still offered worse battery life and smaller software libraries. Price is one component of value, but consumers evaluate the complete package. The Neo Geo Pocket Color's lower price didn't overcome its other disadvantages. Modern companies sometimes forget this lesson. Offering budget alternatives to market leaders works only if the complete value proposition justifies switching. Slightly cheaper products with significant compromises rarely succeed. Consumers often prefer paying more for better experiences over saving money on products that frustrate them. These failed handhelds taught the gaming industry what not to do as clearly as successful products taught what to do. The Game Boy Advance, released in 2001, incorporated lessons from all these failures. It had color graphics with acceptable battery life, learning from the Game Gear and Lynx's mistakes. It maintained backward compatibility with Game Boy and Game Boy Color, learning from Nintendo's own success. It launched with strong software support, learning that games sell hardware. The Nintendo DS, Sony PSP, and subsequent handhelds all showed awareness of these lessons. Battery life became a primary design constraint. Software libraries were cultivated from launch. Pricing was carefully positioned. Marketing emphasized unique value propositions rather than just technical specifications. The failures of the 1990s helped shape the successes of the 2000s and beyond. For those of us who owned or now collect these systems, they represent more than just failed commercial products. They're pieces of gaming history, alternatives to the path the industry ultimately took, glimpses of what might have been. The games remain enjoyable, the hardware remains interesting, and the stories remain worth telling. The Game Gear, Atari Lynx, and Neo Geo Pocket Color deserved better fates than they received. They were built by talented engineers, supported by creative developers, and offered genuine value to players who gave them a chance. Their commercial failures don't diminish their achievements or the enjoyment they provided to millions of players worldwide. In the end, these systems remind us that success isn't just about being better. It's about being better in ways that matter to enough people, at the right time, with the right support, at the right price, with the right marketing. It's about understanding that technology products exist in complex ecosystems where pure technical merit is just one factor among many. Thank you for joining me on this journey through handheld gaming history. These systems may have failed in the marketplace, but they succeeded in pushing the boundaries of what was possible, in creating memorable gaming experiences, and in teaching lessons that shaped the industry's future. They deserve to be remembered not just as footnotes in Nintendo's story, but as worthy competitors that tried their best and left meaningful legacies. If you enjoyed this exploration of gaming history, I invite you to like, subscribe, and share your own memories of these systems in the comments. Perhaps you owned one, or you discovered them later through collecting and emulation. Your stories help keep these systems alive in our collective memory. For now, let your mind rest. Let the memories of these bygone devices wash over you like gentle waves. Picture the glow of a Game Gear's backlit screen in a dark room. Imagine the satisfying click of the Lynx's controls. Remember the solid feel of a Neo Geo Pocket Color in your hands. These systems are gone, but the experiences they created remain. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and drift into sleep. Perhaps to dream of a world where these systems succeeded, where alternative timelines branched off into gaming histories we never saw. Rest well, and good night.